I reckon it's about time I made a video about Grimsby. I've made loads of videos in places like Iraqi Kurdistan and Palestine, more recently West Africa, catching freight trains across the Sahara Desert and that kind of thing. And often I speak a lot about how those places don't actually turn out as bad as they might seem in social media and films on the internet and that kind of thing, and how actually a lot of them have turned out to be some of my favourites that I've ever visited. But you know what I've never done? I've never taken the time to make a video about the place that takes that #1 spot on my all-time favourites list, of course, my beloved hometown Grimsby. So today I'm going to go for a bit of a wander and explore just a few of the reasons why I adore this town. I'm going to try and cover some history stuff that usually gets neglected, going to see some of the more important sites. So whether you're from here or you've heard about us from Channel 4 Skint or that ridiculous Sacha Baron Cohen film, I'm going to try and offer some insight on what it is that I believe is so great about Great Grimsby. That's not a good start, is it? So what is so great about Great Grimsby? Well, as far as the name's concerned, not an awful lot. The great part is only there to distinguish it from a nearby village called Little Grimsby. So unfortunately, the great part's not actually stamped there to tell the world about how mint it is, even though it is quite mint. As far as the name's concerned, it's technically not that great. But is it grim? Well, as everyone who lives here knows, the most tiresome joke in the history of mankind is, oh well, it must be grim up there, it's in the name. Well, if you're going to use parts of towns' names as ammo against said town, well, we've not got it nearly as bad as Scunthorpe, have we? But just as the great part of the name is not intended as a compliment, the grim part's not supposed to be an insult either. The grim part comes from the Danes who settled this town sometime in the 9th century AD, which actually makes Grimsby about the same age as the country Iceland. Now, the Danes are a group of people who tend to worship Norse gods like Odin, and in Norse mythology, Odin walks amongst the mortals and calls himself Grim as a disguise. It's kind of where the Grim Reaper came from as well. So a lot of the Danish settled towns in England have some kind of reference to Odin in the name, and we're no exception. And the B part of the name is the Danish word for village, so technically Grimsby means Odin's village. Town named after a god. It's not so bad now, is it? And here we have the glorious Freeman Street. It's maybe past its heyday. This used to be the high street in Grimsby before a big shopping centre got built and everyone went to shop there instead. So this is a little bit run down, but it's still like the very heart of GY. Wonderful place. To be honest, most of the stuff down here is pretty closed, it's run down, it's neglected, it's not very well cared for. But just here, behind me, this is the birthplace of Grimsby Town Football Club. So, even though it might be a bit past its prime, the fact that Fremo is still home to the pub in which Grimsby Town Football Club as an idea was first conceived is why I think it's still a really important part of the town. And of course it's full of dead good charity shops. The first time we got mentioned officially in literature was in the 1086 Doomsday Book, the famous Doomsday Book. And if you don't know what that is, it was a big survey of England basically set up by William the Conqueror to assess the damages done to England from the Norman conquest and see who was still alive, basically, see which towns still existed. And I think there were 13,418 towns surveyed. If that's right, I deserve a Peace Prize, and Grimsby was one of them. And at that time, in 1086, about 100 years after being founded, and about 1,000 years ago now, the town was listed as having 200 inhabitants. And then if we fast forward about 800 years from the Doomsday mention, we end up in the middle of the 19th century, and that's a time in which Grimsby was booming. The population had exploded and it got to around 75,000 people living there. And that was also a time in which that massive, magnificent tower was built. That is, of course, the Dock Tower. It was finished in 1852, and fun fact, it was constructed using 1 million bricks. How about that? It stands 309 feet tall, so it's enormous, and well, it had to be because the whole point was to create hydraulic power to power all of the dock's machinery, but it's also a really big thing and still is today in Grimsby's heritage and a skyline feature, and to be honest it's just a really good symbol of how on top of the game Grimsby's docks were. But there was quite a big hiccup with the dock tower, and that's because it was built in the 19th century, and the 19th century was a period in which technology was progressing extremely quickly. So what actually happened was, between the first brick being laid and it being finished and ready to be opened, the technology behind it was completely obsolete. So as soon as it opened, it was already useless. But 167 years later, it still stands as a reminder of town's glorious heritage and industrial magnificence. Either that or they didn't want to knock it down and spend so much money on it, but who knows. Either way, we've ended up with a big pointy iconic structure that you can see from miles away because of how big it is. In fact, you can see it from the other side of the River Humber, and if you're further away than that, there is also a version that you can see if you go to Legoland in Windsor, because that and the dock offices in fact have both got dedicated models at the Windsor Resort. At Legoland, you'll also find a Lego version of this, Victoria Mill, and Corporation Bridge just there behind me, which means we've got 4 things at Legoland, and I reckon that probably makes us the best represented town per capita in the world, probably. And that's something to shout about, innit? And here we are at Alexandra Dock, absolutely my favourite part of the town. Look at it, it's magnificent. It was named Alexandra Dock after a visit from the Princess and Prince of Wales, so Edward VII and Alexandra of Denmark visited in 1879, and this was all opened in 1880. Absolutely tremendous. Corporation Bridge was opened a bit after that in 1925. That was opened by Edward VIII. And interestingly, although this dock is technically not really a dock anymore and the bridge is inactive to any kind of shipping, it is still covered by an Act of Parliament to open upon request by the government. So if the government says open it, they've got to open it, except they won't be able to open it because it stopped working a couple of years ago, and the last test run they tried to do, it didn't actually do anything, so it's kind of a bit broken. But anyway, regardless of any functionality problems, that bridge and Victoria Mill constitute part of what I consider to be the best vista, the best view I've ever come across anywhere in the world, the rest of which is of course made up by the glorious Ross Tiger. The Ross Tiger made up what was at the time the world's largest fishing fleet. In the 60s and 70s there were up to 700 trawlers going from Grimsby to the North Sea fishing, absolutely dominating the industry. And do you know what's left 40 years later? This one trawler. This is what's left of Grimsby's incredible fishing heritage. The Ross Tiger served as a middle water trawler from 1957 to 1984, and that was a time in Grimsby in which, in one capacity or another, you were involved in the fish industry. You were a fisherman, you processed it, you delivered it, you sold it, or whatever. The whole town pretty much was completely embedded in the idea that Grimsby had become the world's premier fishing port. Not the UK's, not Europe's, the world's. We were brilliant at it. This boat represents such a prosperous, successful, even like communal period for the town, because everyone was working, like doing the same thing, everyone was tied into the same industry, and that's probably why it was such a world-beating era for Grimsby. But the problem with that is, when the industry then sees a bit of a decline, it's not just a few people here and there that lose jobs, it's the entire town. The whole town suffered as a result, and that's exactly what happened after the third and final Cod War took place in the 1970s. I'm not going to go into detail with the Cod Wars, that's a whole video in itself, but what happened is the entire industry essentially just disappeared for Grimsby at that time, and that's why this boat that was originally built for £6 million in today's money was sold for a quid in 1992 to be put here as a monument slash in its final resting place. But rather than be a bit sad about it, I think that's a stunning reminder of how we were the best at something. We were world beaters, we had the world's biggest fishing fleet, we had the best fishermen, we had the best fishing port, and it wasn't even that long ago. And you know what? Here's some proof. And this, by the way, is that view I was talking about. Look at it, it is splendid. So we may have fallen off the map a little bit as of the 70s, but we did get a celebrity mention or two. And no, I'm not talking about Sacha Baron Cohen, I'm talking of course about Elton John. He released a song called Grimsby in 1974, written by his mate Bernie Taupin. That song was on his album called Caribou, which went double platinum. It was nominated for a Grammy, it went #1 in the UK, USA, Australia, Denmark and Canada. And so compared to a box office flop which represents us all feeding babies beer and weeing out of windows, I think that's a much nicer representation. So cheers Elton, mate. And then in 1998 we topped the charts all by ourselves, because we were reported by the BBC to have returned to the #1 spot on the food production leaderboard, but this time it was not to do with fish but pizza. According to the BBC, in 1998 Grimsby was churning out 1 million pizzas every single day. That's more than anyone else in Europe, that's more than Italy. 1 million every day. So what we'd essentially done is we're taking all the workforce that was made redundant from the cataclysmic fall of the fishing industry, turned our hands to other tastes, and you know what, we became the best once again. Million pizzas a day. How about that? Under here, right near the centre of town, we've got a dead swanky mural towards famous Grimbarians. Got Freddie Frith, Brenda Fisher, Shirley Bloomer, obviously Town. Look at these three absolute animals. Bogle, Daisley McEwen, absolute geezers, Guy Martin, the Cliftons, and Sir John Hurt, all from Grimsby. And here we are at the home of the mighty Mariners. You didn't think we'd miss it out, did you? We saw earlier down Freeman where they were born. Well, here's where they live now, the glorious Blundell Park. So yeah, here we are at the very core of so many loyal town fans' spirits. Even though we're in Cleethorpes and this video is meant to be about Grimsby, I couldn't really miss it out, could I? And yeah, as many of you probably know by now, Grimsby are the only team in the Football League to play none of its games at home because its stadium is actually in the next town along. But seeing as we're already here, we've cheated, we've come to Cleethorpes and left Grimsby, we may as well go over some trivia of this tremendous football club. So the club was formed in 1878 under the name Grimsby Pelham, in that pub that we saw earlier. Do you want to know the reason for that meeting in the first place? It's because the cricketers had nothing to do with their evening, so they thought, let's go for a kickabout, and the football team that is now GTFC was born. The famous black and white stripes of GY didn't actually get adopted until 1925, so they played for ages without them. Before that they had white and blue horizontal stripes, and after that they went to brown and blue checkers, and then in 1925 they finally adopted the famous colours we know today. Since then, Grimsby Town have set the record attendance at Old Trafford, with 77,000 people turning up to watch them play Wolves in the FA Cup. I mean, we got battered 5-0, but let's ignore that bit and focus on the part where even Man U can't beat that record at their own stadium. We've also got the oldest football stand in English football. The main stand in the stadium was built in 1901, and although it's been built around a bit, it's still the original one from before. So there's that. And then just a few years ago, Town set another record, technically an unofficial one, of having the greatest fans in the universe when Operation Promotion happened. This is something else that I could speak about for hours, but I'll try and keep it quite compact. So in 2015, Town just finished up their 5th season in a row in the conference, which is outside the Football League. So obviously, goal number 1 is to get back into the Football League. But we lost for 3 years in a row in the playoffs, and obviously that's incredibly boring. So some fans had the idea to start a crowdfunder and try and raise 20 grand to give to the manager towards new players or wages or whatever you want. And already 20 grand is quite a big ask. But do you want to know how much money Operation Promotion raised just from the fans alone? 110,000 quid. 110 grand. We bought a player called Omar Bogle. He was there for the next season. He was absolutely brilliant, animal, my opinion, cult hero. We got to the playoffs and we finally won, and we got back into the Football League after 6 years in the conference, and it was the biggest relief in the world. It was all made possible by that crowdfunder, by the fans being brilliant, keeping up their following to every game, even after that many years outside of the Football League. And to be honest, it just demonstrates how incredible the fans are for town. It's what the fans deserved, it's what the manager deserved, but overall it's just a really good representation again of like the community feel within Grimsby. Everyone gets together for good things like that. But what about now, 2019? What have we got to look forward to? What have we got at present to be proud of? What's still happening in GY? Well, we still host the UK's largest port. It's 33% bigger than London and twice as big as anywhere else in the UK in terms of tonnage. We still have the UK's largest fish market and we still process most of the country's fish. We also have an EU recognised PGI, which is a protected geographical indicator. It's kind of a food award for certain heritage foods for our Grimsby traditional smoked fish, which is cooked in chimneys. It's smoked using sawdust. And so basically, despite the whole downturn in the fish industry, we've bounced back pretty well and remained a seafood capital of the country. Anyway, aside from all the fishy business, we have this wonderful beach, we've got a great football club, and I think officially now we are the greenest town in the UK because they reckon that 28% of all the energy we use comes from renewable sources. That's way ahead of second place Doncaster, and if you look at places like Manchester at 6% and London at less than 0.1%, it really goes to show how far ahead of the curve we are when it comes to green energy. And that's probably where the future of this town's industry lies. Anyway, that's about that. There's just a few reasons why I adore my hometown, what I think makes Grimsby so great, and why I'm so proud to be from where I'm from. We've got a brilliant history to look back on, we've got a lot to look forward to, and in the meantime, we've got plenty to enjoy. The next time you see me, I'm going to be in Kazakhstan and probably in some of the other stands around that area. So if you're intrigued about the rest of the world, then stay tuned, but I hope today you've enjoyed a wander around my tremendous hometown. Cheers boys, see you in a bit.